Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to Red Kite Project's webinar, The High Cost of Burnout in Transit. I'm Charlotte DiBartolomeo, CEO and founder of Red Kite, and I'm here with Zach Stone, co-founder and CSO.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
As many of you know, Red Kite Project is a human resilience firm working within high-pressure industries to address the impact of stress and burnout, which often results in skyrocketing absenteeism, lowered retention rates, workplace violence, and accidents. We've entered our 8th year in the transit industry. Can you believe that, Zach?
No, it's hard to believe, but transit gets in your blood.
Well, that's the truth. We continue to work with great organizations such as SEPTA here in Philadelphia, Go Raleigh, Go Durham, and CATS in North Carolina, and now Metro Transit in Minneapolis. We've also presented our work at APTA and written for Metro Magazine and
Mass Transit
too. We've trained more than 6,000 employees in transit and continue to consult with transit executives across the industry to help improve the quality of service their employees give to their customers, but also improve their bottom line. I'm going to go over the objectives of this webinar and share our hypothesis regarding burnout itself, and then turn this over to Zach, who'll start the meat of the presentation. I will be jumping in to talk about specific causes and signs of burnout and some strategies for countering disengagement and burnout after he speaks about the cost of all this. But before we get started, I want to be clear about something. Red Kite does not believe that every employee is experiencing burnout or trauma. Sometimes an employee is just not right for the job and really doesn't meet the standard for the hiring profile. Okay, on to the seminar objectives. First of all, we're going to list and describe best practices for reducing the impact of burnout as it relates to safety. We'll also examine the financial cost and operational cost of those impacts. We'll define employee burnout and disengagement. And we'll explore the causes of burnout and stress and the correlation between burnout and operator accidents, rule violations, and operator conflicts and assaults. Okay, so here's Red Kite Project's hypothesis. We posit that transit is a high-pressure industry with a workforce required to balance competing goals of safety and timeliness while servicing a very complex and often disadvantaged customer population. The task of managing this workforce is complicated by strict policy guidelines, quasi-governmental stakeholders, and budgets dictated by politics rather than performance. These challenges put the entire employee population at greater risk for burnout and disengagement, which is evidenced by the high incidence of absenteeism and lowered retention rates, operator assaults, and accidents plaguing the industry. So in order to mitigate absenteeism, retention, and accidents, the industry has to address burnout and disengagement and create strategic responses to overcome them.
Before we jump into the figures, again, just one more time, we want to reiterate that we do not think that every employee in your organization is burned out or traumatized. Quite the contrary. In fact, a lot of times people are coming through the doors of your company with some really serious baggage that's hampering them from the start. So our goal is to try to prevent that from happening. But this talk is about the employees that are, no matter how it happened, they are dealing with burnout. And it's unfortunately costing transit companies and every other company in the United States a very large sum of money and operational damage. In the 50-year review of bus driver stress, the research, mined back in 1991 at that point, showed that in the U.S., nearly 1/4 of total public transportation operating budgets were going to cover costs related to absenteeism. Now, since then, the numbers have dramatically increased as burnout and disengagement have increased. Back in 1991, barely anyone was talking about burnout, and now today, it's most of what organizational development specialists are discussing because it is such a problem. So those numbers are often much higher than just a quarter of the operating budget. Job stress costs the U.S. economy some $300 billion in sick time, long-term disability, and excessive job turnover. Research has convincingly shown that employees who are at risk of burnout, those who are chronically exhausted and they hold a negative, cynical attitude towards their work, will show impaired job performance and may face some very serious health problems over the course of time. 3/4 of employees believe the worker has more on-the-job stress than a generation ago. Problems at work are more strongly associated with health complaints than any other life stressor, more so than even financial problems or family problems. And this comes from a variety of insurance companies dealing with the claims. Healthcare expenditures are nearly 50% greater for workers who report high levels of stress. Stress is very costly. 70% of employee absence through research has been found to be stress-related illness. So unscheduled absenteeism in transit is costing, and this is just in the US, between $1.5 and $3 billion per year. And the thing is, many authorities are still struggling to quantify just how much they're actually losing because there are less obvious operational impacts that are happening that you may or may not be connecting to absenteeism, turnover, and burnout and disengagement. But the goal is to uncover those and stop them. Many authorities are averaging between 30% and 50% daily absenteeism rates. The MBTA last year spent over $75 million in overtime pay. More than 40% of that went to workers who work less than 40 hours per week at the regular rate. On any given day, 1 out of 3 MARTA frontline employees is absent. Now, before we jump into the conversation about work ethic not being what it used to be in millennials, the average age of a MARTA worker is 47. And across transit in general, the average age of the worker tends to be higher than many other industries. Burned out individuals at the same time experience high levels of chronic fatigue and distance themselves mentally and physically from their work activities. Employees with high levels of burnout are more likely to report a range of physiological and physical health problems, including anxiety, depression, sleep disturbance, insomnia, memory impairment, and neck and back pain. Nearly 50% of workers experiencing burnout look for other jobs. So when workers are stressed, they think about going elsewhere. Just to give you some comparison here, public transit operators at some authorities have retention rates of only 20% of employees who make it from day one of the hiring process to being employed for 1 year. So that's an almost 80% turnover rate in some cases, compared to the police, who on average have about an 87% retention rate. It's only 13% turnover rate. And corrections officers at some of the most dangerous federal penitentiaries have a turnover rate of only 38%. The cost of replacing a worker can run between 50% and 200% of the annual salary listed for that position due to a number of issues, including employee coverage, disability, and training costs. Some authorities report losing 100% of their new bus operator hopefuls during their onboarding and training process. So they hire a group of 20 or 30 new drivers, and as they are going through the training process and by the time they hit the street alone, there's no one left from that hiring class. But that earlier $300 billion burnout estimate that we talked about around absences, that does not include the $450 billion to $550 billion that Gallup says that disengaged workers who show up to work, this idea of presenteeism, they're there but they're not really there, is costing the United States every year. In Gallup's analysis, they measured and spoke to over 25 million different employees, and what they found was that only 30% of workers were engaged or considered themselves being inspired at their work. 50% reported that they were not engaged, and the remaining 20% said they were actively disengaged or they hated their job. Now, sometimes we'll hear leaders say, well, I don't pay them to like their job. I don't care if they like their job. I pay them to show up. That's a very costly attitude, and we're going to explain why. Nearly 48% is a number that is important here. In 2002, Molson Brewing Company discovered that engaged employees are 5 times less likely to have safety accidents. And according to UNC's Keenan Flagler School of Business, back in 2013, they found that organizations with higher engagement and well-being had on average nearly 48% less safety accidents, 37% less absenteeism, and 25% less turnover. And this was in high turnover, high pressure industries, which transit is. The numbers were even more significant in less high pressure industries. Just to give you an idea how connected burnout is with accidents, one of the only industries with disengagement and burnout close to that of the transit industry is the healthcare industry. Over 50% of physicians and nurses report burnout symptoms. This is significant because medical errors are the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. The 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. Now, that connection between burnout and disengagement and errors and accidents is huge. And it's something that we all need to be paying attention to because it is literally life or death. Burnout and disengagement are destroying the safety culture in transit and our operations budgets. High absenteeism puts stress on the drivers that do show up, that then have to shoulder the burden, which increases their fatigue and their burnout, leading them to become more absent more regularly and get sick more often. High turnover, which means that more inexperienced drivers are coming through the door. They have low seniority to start, meaning they're working irregular hours, and that translates to more accidents. We've also found that drivers who have been working for many years, who have then been shouldering the burden, who become burned out, are much more likely also in their later career to have significantly more accidents as well. Burnout amongst employees creates low morale. It's about a cynical attitude towards work, and that cynical attitude is like a virus, and it spreads immediately to your new hires, poisoning the morale and the engagement in the company, and then the cycle continues over and over. Now I'm going to hand this over to Charlotte so that she can speak about some of the safety predators towards the safety culture in transit.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate that. That medical errors, that is
It's
really
incredible.
something. That's really crazy. Well, as Zach mentioned, disengagement and burnout are destroying safety culture in this industry. And we've identified 3 big safety predators that you as industry leaders are definitely contending with. The first is driver fatigue. Driver fatigue. According to a University of Florida School of Engineering study in 2010, there was a 56.5% correlation between driver fatigue and crash occurrences in commercial drivers. I'll bet that record really doesn't surprise you. It makes a lot of sense, but there's more to it than that. Look, after listening to more than 5,000 frontline personnel, some of whom have witnessed and experienced potentially traumatic events in the workplace, and again, not everybody, but some have, such as fatal accidents or have been involved in them, violent interactions with passengers, we've identified professional trauma exposure as a safety predator. Because of the time constraints here, we're not going to go deeply into PTE in this webinar, but we will do a follow-up in a few months, promise you that. Suffice to say that PTE is not nearly as prevalent as burnout. Let me say that again. PTE is not nearly as prevalent as burnout. But when it does occur, professional trauma exposure may rewire the operator's neurobiology so that they have this exaggerated threat response and they get into many more fights. We see this all the time. They may adapt by disassociating on the job, which is a fancy word for experiencing dangerously long periods of tuning out. They just kind of shut down. And they also suffer from flashbacks, which also destroys their attention to the road. The third safety predator is burnout. According to a study conducted by the Institute of Naval Medicine, individuals who are stressed are more likely to have an accident in the workplace because of a propensity for cognitive failures. These cognitive failures show up as forgetfulness, distractibility, and false triggering. If you're wondering what false triggering is, I'll tell you. It refers to interrupted cognitive and motor functioning. Of course, a certain amount of stress is an unavoidable byproduct of any high-pressure industry, and job stress that overwhelms the worker to the point of exhaustion is not good. But if it also overwhelms them with exhaustion and demotivation, it's burnout, and it's to be regarded as a serious safety hazard. So what is burnout? Well, according to Christina Maslach, PhD from the University of California, burnout is a syndrome with emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, which is a kind of detachment, just going through life. You're there, you're in the moment, you see things that are happening, but you're a little detached from it, and a reduced personal accomplishment. So you don't feel like you have anything that you've accomplished or that you are accomplishing anything. Those are the core features. And we will be sending you some links around that so you can take a look at this yourself. But I want you, in order to understand burnout, consider it as a metaphor. The metaphor of a house on fire, with you in it. So let's think about this. You're in your kitchen, the stove suddenly goes up in flames. And as you try to put the fire out, you notice now that it's spreading to the dining room curtains. When you run to the dining room with a fire extinguisher, you notice the flames are making their way up the stairs. So this is when you grab the dog and you run outside to a safe spot in the yard, because you are no longer trying to save the house. Your main goal, your only goal, frankly, is to survive. Work-related stress, which overwhelms one's capabilities and their resources, feels just like this. Okay, so let's take a look at the signs of burnout. Are you seeing these signs in your workforce? And maybe you're seeing it in yourself, but okay. So what are you seeing in your workforce? People who are burned out usually feel a sense of betrayal by their organization. They have a cynical attitude towards the public. They're either overreactive or underreactive to events and problems, are absent or late much more often. They show a loss of interest in their work. They're chronically fatigued, and they show poor judgment. They say inappropriate things to passengers and coworkers. Getting back to Christina Maslach, who developed the Burnout Inventory, which is a tool that measures burnout in the workforce, and again, something that we can send you a link to. Maslach says there are 6 types of workplace experiences which tend to cause burnout. When an employee feels a lack of reward for the work that they're doing, and this is not just a financial reward, this is feeling that people don't commend them, don't see what they're doing, don't sense that what they're doing is valuable to the organization. When they feel a lack of control over the work they do, and this could show up as no control over scheduling or route or what days you're working, and are isolated from a supportive community. Also, experiencing a conflict in values between themselves and those they work with, such as a customer population whose values are markedly different from their own. If they perceive the absence of fairness in the workplace and have serious work overload. So, based on our experiences with the frontline in transit and grounded in Maslach's work on burnout, which we believe is very important to all of this, we at Red Kite have identified these specific causes of burnout in the transit industry. And we also know that you are the experts here, and so you may be coming up with some of your own. But what we've seen are multiple events and interactions producing anxiety, such as, again, inclement weather, coupled with multiple interactions with a frustrated and rude customer population. When an employee is unprepared to de-escalate the conflict and crises that are becoming more regular in the life of an operator. When an employee brings unresolved psychological trauma to the workplace. And what am I talking about here? Personal baggage, stuff people bring that they haven't resolved in their own personal lives. It definitely makes them more susceptible to burnout. A culture of blame rather than a culture of support. This occurs when the frontline feels that management thinks an accident or an assault is automatically the operator's fault. And I want to say about that, whether you feel that way or not, sometimes a person will think that you said something when you actually didn't, but it's because when an accident occurs or when a person is in the midst of a fight and they have experienced a lot of survival chemicals and they feel very threatened, they're going to respond after the event still in an extremely threatened way. And so they may hear something that you didn't even say, but their perception will go a long way for creating burnout. So believing that supervision and management are also out of touch with the frontline's lived experience is another one. When the frontline lives in a relative isolation from the passengers they're picking up, which causes them to dehumanize the passengers and themselves, which, by the way, is often self-fulfilling prophecy. We know this. We've heard this. When the operator is returning to negative depot garage environments. And, this is one of those things where a person can come in, they're a new hire, they have a very good attitude, they are ready for the job, and they really like their job, but they keep coming back to a workplace where there's a lot of rumor, there's a lot of negativity, and that stuff spreads, and that makes it really hard for a person, even a person who's pretty strong and resilient, to maintain their resiliency over a period of time when everything is so negative. Also, when there's a lack of communication regarding route information, weather-related issues, and holiday schedules, they're just like kept in the dark. That's something that really disturbs people and makes them feel very burned out. When the operator is trying to balance on-time performance with safe driving practices, which is certainly something that they must do, but over a period of time, that can really debilitate them, or balance on-time performance with superior customer service.
Something I just wanted to add quickly. There's things that happen that we don't even realize organizationally that may cause some of these things. So this isn't necessarily your behavior. isolation and dehumanization of passengers and self. So one thing that's been observed across the industry in general, cashiers in a booth. What's research has shown is that those who are sitting in that booth isolated from the public, there's a tendency for their incidents to go up, negative incidents with customers. In fact, cashiers in some cases start to exhibit behaviors close to those who have been in isolation in prison, in solitary, over time. And that's just the design of the booth. Or perhaps we've also seen situations where assaults have actually gone up against drivers after shields have been put in place, where drivers feel that they are even more closed off to the public. It sets up a negative interaction off the bat.
It is that self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely. But it isn't just something that you do perhaps as a leader. There's also environmental issues and design issues at play that can be changed as well.
Yes, and it's how the customer sees the operator or the person behind.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Zach was bringing up some very interesting things, and it leads into this. Why is burnout dangerous? When you think about somebody who is an operator and feels threatened, they begin operating with survival mode rather than cognitive reasoning. They are feeling threatened. They think everybody is out to get them after a while. And in other words, when they are feeling that way, their decision-making is not logical or generally concerned with the entire group of people, because after all, they're feeling isolated now. They are not concerned about the people that they're servicing. Really, their only concern is just for themselves. So let's take a closer look at behaviors associated with burnout to see if any of this resonates with you. If person may be feeling highly agitated and starts to act out with explosive behaviors, anger, just really responding in a way that's not the usual professional way. Their decision-making is based, as I said, on immediate survival rather than responding cognitively, logically. The person sometimes resorts to self-medicating to quiet their anxiety and stress. And certainly there are a lot of reasons why people self-medicate, but anxiety and stress is one of them. And in a driving profession, it's deadly. So it's something that has to be addressed. There's often an inability to stay present in the moment and an inability to concentrate, which is very dangerous when one's behind the wheel. And finally, the person often appears to be listless and sleepy, and you may be seeing this person thinking, what is going on with them? Are they not getting enough sleep? Well, they're just going through their day this way. Frequently, people who are burned out will get enough sleep. Sometimes they sleep a lot, and they wake up and they're still tired. That is a feature of burnout, and it's something to be addressed when you start thinking about the causes of the fatigue and all of that. Okay, so let's take a look at the emotional impacts of burnout, what the person's feeling. As we had mentioned before, there's a sense of isolation, and this isolation spreads through the agency. So you may have been doing all kinds of things to create a warm and welcoming atmosphere in the depots and the garages, but you're seeing that people don't talk to each other, or when they do talk to each other, there's some negativity happening, and you cannot figure out what's going on. Well, if your folks are burned out, they're not going to want to talk to each other. So no matter what you do, it seems like it's just not happening. You have to go a little bit more deeply than that. So also there's this loss of joy and feelings of anxiety, as I mentioned. There's also paranoia, and we see this an awful lot when we work with people, where something may have happened years ago, but they keep carrying it on, and they see every manager or even coworker as somebody who's a threat to them, and they feel paranoid about it. Also, this epidemic of negative attitudes throughout the agency, as I mentioned. And finally, feeling depressed, which can become a clinical depression and will be something that people will end up on disability for if it's not taken care of. So it's not all negative. It is not all something that you can't address. There are a lot of things that we believe that can be quick and easy fixes. There are some deeper, longer fixes, but I'm going to start with these intervention strategies, and then Zach's going to get into it a little bit more deeply. But we believe that showing support to employees during the stressful work experiences, when there's such as inclement weather, large events, when there has been an assault, and the whole depot is feeling as if there's no help and no support, that's definitely a time for you to show up and be supportive. Regularly engage in frontline employees in conversations that aren't just about discipline. When you have an understanding of who your folks are, and when you show them that you care about them as human beings, it makes a real difference in the work life that they have because they want to come to work. They feel that they're being appreciated. Empowering employees to generate solutions when feasible. I know this can be difficult, but if you start to think of it that the frontline folks are the ones who are out on the streets, they know what's happening, they can be an enormous resource for you. And if we think about how people start to get burned out because they feel like they have no control and no power of their work life, this sort of thing can be very helpful. Just asking people what they think can be useful to make a shift will help them to feel like they are valuable and that they're being heard. Connect employees with purpose and meaning. So when it comes to the front line, these jobs can be really tough, not just because it's hard to drive people around who have often many, many complex issues, the customer population. But even when a driver goes home, sometimes they'll have someone at their house who's saying to them, you know what, you just drive a bus. You really don't do much. And you know, how is this job so hard? And if they feel like their supervisors feel that way about them and their managers feel that way about them, that can be very difficult. So giving people a sense of purpose. When we started to share with people the way that we saw their jobs as shepherds in their communities to help people get where they needed to go, and sometimes assist people who were really having difficulty, that made a big difference in the way they saw themselves. And frankly, sometimes they're first responders to crisis and conflict, and they can make or break a person's situation. We've heard multiple stories where people have saved folks' lives, their customers' lives, and that means a lot to them and makes them feel like, wow, I'm doing a job here. I'm doing something that's really important. And when you go back and you look at what was happening with the police force that Zach was showing earlier and how they stayed on their job longer, I think it has something to do with purpose and feeling a sense that their job matters. It's important to them. Also, just cutting managers who destroy morale. When a person feels like they don't have understanding from their manager, they feel like it's just something that, you know, no matter what I say or do, my manager is going to look at me and think that I'm the one in the wrong. They will have a tendency to get really paranoid, and they won't come to you with problems, and that can become something that's escalated. Also, regular burnout awareness campaigns and trainings. People don't know what they don't know about themselves. They don't know when they're seeing some of these things in themselves, that they're really tired or they're irritable. They may just think, well, I'm working too hard and, you know, everybody out there is just ridiculous. So why should I have to be worried about them? And this isn't me, this is you. So giving people some understanding of burnout can help them to create awareness in themselves. Also, conflict de-escalation training. It's difficult out there with a complex customer population, and so when you can help people to understand the best ways to de-escalate a conflict, they feel more prepared. And reviewing and strengthening EAP. EAP is extremely valuable. You were talking about it, and you'll be talking about it again here. But this is the kind of thing where if a person doesn't feel comfortable with their EAP or doesn't know about their EAP, then they're not going to access it. So making sure that the EAP understands stress disorders. Creating wellness initiatives that include physical exercise. Movement is a huge burnout buster. Very important.
So there's been a lot of studies done. In fact, there's been over 80 years of research done into the health and wellness of transit operators, going back to before World War II. And most recently, studies that have been done by Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and then ultimately the one that's pictured now, the American Institute for Preventive Medicine, they found that for every dollar invested in wellness programs, there was an up to $5.93 average return to the company in savings around medical costs, absenteeism, and workman's comp. Some of the most effective programs, when they did the research, were shown to be on-site exercise programs, like Charlotte just mentioned, mental and physical awareness education, And then finally, educating supervisors on mental health and burnout so that they could recognize what was going on with their people and support them rather than just use punitive measures. Because the reality is, punitive measures are not going to stop burnout. Support and medical and health interventions will. And so the reality is that the savings here are tremendous. In fact, they're too good to pass up. And we'll talk a little bit more about what wellness, investing in wellness looks like. One of the things to keep in mind is that according to the World Health Organization, 50% of patients do not take their medication as prescribed, with cost and access being one of the biggest factors. And this leads to unhealthier employees. So something to keep in mind, one free way to supplement your benefits package is to offer prescription savings cards. FamilyWise is a free prescription savings card, and it's something that you can provide at no cost to your employees or yourselves, and it gets the best price possible on medication. Diabetes, ischemic heart disease, back pain, mobility, arthritis are huge in the bus driver and conductor and engineering populations. And so this is something that doesn't interfere with your existing insurance plans. It's just something that you can give your employees to show them that you care, and certainly we'll include the resources for how you can contact FamilyWise to get those cards, or your employees can reach out and get them. As we mentioned earlier, early intervention and prevention are the most cost-effective and efficient methods for stopping and reducing burnout and disengagement. So it's vital that we start looking at the very beginning of when employees interact with our authorities and our organizations. We need to examine and evolve the hiring practices so that we ensure that we're getting the highest performers that have the necessary mindset and skills. Not everyone can be a professional transit operator. It's a hard job, and it requires a very specific mindset and attitude and skills. So, for example, authorities for a long time were using a hiring profile of former long-haul truck drivers because, they have CDLs. But the problem is that we were finding, when we were training them, those individuals really struggled, many of them, with communication skills that were needed to manage the frequent customer interactions and the complex behavioral challenges of those customer populations. What we have found to be some of the most successful hiring profiles are former military members because of their adherence to policy and timeliness, crisis workers, behavioral healthcare workers, teachers. Those are some of the individuals who have done really well and have longevity on the job. Outdated, off-the-shelf hiring assessments will fail to give you, I'm going to say that again, these outdated, off-the-shelf assessments will fail to give you the right indicators for job success or failure. Today, we have scientifically valid assessments that can measure a person's overall wellness and resilience under stress, their likelihood of burning out, their distractibility, how easily they get triggered to anger, their level of self-control, and their adherence to timeliness. The culture of the workplace has changed, and how people expect to be treated by their employer has also shifted. So if the first points of contact of a potential new hire has with the company are negative or unprofessional, top performers are going to quickly opt for a different environment. So when you're assessing and you're hiring and you're training, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is bringing in and retaining the top performers. It's really important. Otherwise, they're going to leave for a different work environment. So another effective method of retaining the most dedicated rather than just the most desperate is to shift when people can take their applications and their assessments and how you do your training process to nights and weekends. Now, I know before the collective gasp happens, it's important to realize that this is going to allow the people who have a steady job, who don't want to call out of their work, to come in and go through your hiring practice to take part. Because otherwise, the people that are most likely to go through the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday application, assessment, and hiring process are those who either don't have jobs or those who don't mind calling out of their job. And that's not necessarily the person that you want. So when your frontline workers are going through this process, this 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday, and then all of a sudden, after training ends, and then they abruptly have inconsistent hours, they lose their weekends off, this generally sends a shockwave to their families, to these new hires. Even if you've been warning them verbally that this is going to happen, we find that the only real way to prepare people and their families for this is literally to have them go through it. And so that's why shifting and adjusting your hiring and training process is extremely important. Otherwise, it does cause people to leave. At the very least, it increases the speed at which they burn out or they disengage.
Well, and if you're getting them to do it a little bit at a time, it's helpful. So before they're out there by themselves with the passengers, if they're starting to understand what the nights and weekends are like, then once they get out there with the passengers, they've already got that part down, but now they can.
Absolutely. It gives them a taste. And it allows you really quickly to weed out someone who's a wrong fit, rather than after you've invested thousands of dollars and weeks in the training process to have this person turn around and in their exit interview say, personal reasons, I'm leaving, which really means I wasn't aware, my family wasn't aware, we can't handle this a lot of times. So we don't want that. Charlotte mentioned it, invest in EAP. Research has found that employees who attend EAP programs showed improvement in all 5 areas that they were surveyed for: absenteeism, presenteeism, work engagement, life satisfaction, and workplace distress. According to the Federal Health Occupation Organization, people who reported that it was difficult to do their jobs properly because of the emotional problems they were facing before participating in EAP showed a 73% increase in productivity after using the EAP service. But here's the thing. It's estimated that only about 4 to 6% of workers access EAP programs. And I'm going to be real with you. The reality is that not all EAP programs are created equal. It's important to research the right provider, find ones that have a good reputation and ratings from clients. Many bus operators that we've spoken with over the years have voiced a very strong distrust in attending EAP for fear that it's going to be used against them. Some drivers have claimed that it has been used against them. And so doing regular education about EAP's value and reminders in a regular way around the garages, around the building can be helpful. Also, using it as a supportive step in the discipline process before you get to punitive measures can be really valuable for getting more buy-in. Showing people that EAP is there to help them, it's not a punishment. In fact, they may get a lot of very serious value about it, and if they do, that word of mouth will spread through the organization as well. Training. Coming back to training, we talked about it briefly, but training and education are a very effective tool in combating burnout and low performance, according to the research. But it has to be backed up and revisited. Many of us, including myself, can barely remember what we ate for breakfast yesterday. So it's important that when you invest in training, and good training does cost, that you back it up and you choose a program that meets certain requirements. Number one, it should be specific to transit, because if it isn't, drivers or engineers or conductors, managers, they're going to chew it up and spit it out as not having anything to do with their job. They're going to shut it out. 2, it has to be spread across the authority and have buy-in from all levels. If only your front line is getting it, but everyone else is not subscribing to this new type of way of acting and being, the drivers, the conductors, they have a very good excuse for saying, well, if we're the only ones who have to do this, no, sorry, we're not. No one else is adopting this behavior. Why should we be the only ones? There has to be opportunities for research, access to materials to help remind the trainees of what they've learned. Leaders have to place videos, posters, the education, whatever it is throughout the physical space, including the garages, even on the vehicle can be very helpful, and throughout the different offices and buildings, because these constant visual cues are going to help keep the training in the front of employees' minds until it becomes stored in their long-term memory. Otherwise, it'll be in the short-term memory and then it's going to get forgotten. It has to be evidence-based. It can't be flavor of the month pop psychology, fun, unicorns and rainbow stuff, because that just doesn't work, and it's not going to be adopted by hardened frontline workers.
Yeah, operators don't go for that.
Nope, then they do not. So thankfully, there's over 80 years of transit research into wellness, health, and performance improvement. Very substantial body of evidence that shows very clearly what types of interventions work, what have worked, and what does not work. And we will provide those resources as well for you to take a look. So some of the responsive things, because those are interventions that we can do up front for preventative purposes. But when things are when burnout and disengagement are sort of starting to rear their ugly head, some things that we can do: assign a regular mentor, or have a leader come and visit, a high up leader come and visit and shadow with employees. We have seen in the industry that this has created tremendous buy-in and built huge bridges between frontline workers and top-level leadership to have an executive leader come and shadow employees for an entire run or an entire day. Yes, it takes a lot of time. Yes, it takes a lot of effort. Yes, it is a risk, but the transformative effects that we have seen when executive level leaders have gotten out on the vehicles or in the booths with cashiers and drivers, they pay for themselves many, many, many times over. Also, what we have found is that if you're finding that workers are having some difficulties, a new hire is struggling, assigning them a regular positive mentor with a good record saw a reduction of 2 weeks of absenteeism days on average. That's 14 days per employee that you get back. That's a lot of money that you could save there. Examine your point system. Look, we get it. In general, this is something that we know that not all authorities can do because you're tied up in contractual obligations. But with a lot of different organizations we've worked with, we found that hourly employees actually get more points for coming in late than they do for staying home for the full day. We get it. You do not want to encourage lateness, and so that's one way to do it. But as today's work attitudes have changed, where people would rather have the day off than miss a day of pay in some cases, you're not punishing them, you're punishing yourselves by paying for a lot of overtime. That's tremendous overtime to have someone cover perhaps an 8-hour run, whereas you could have had a person be a few minutes late and then pick up that run or a different run. So there's ways to change your point systems, or at least re-examine how you're doing that to see if you can cut down on overtime pay. And then finally, look for a behavior gap between upper and mid-level management and supervisors and dispatchers. These poor relations and morale, it does chase off high performers early in the process. We've seen with our own eyes situations where top leaders will come into a class of new hires or even seasoned employees. They'll greet them warmly. They'll share their ideas for the vision of the company. They'll tell them about how incredible their hard work is and how valued they are and how excited they are to have them at the company. They'll walk out of the room, and then someone in the middle of the organization or a supervisor or a dispatcher will walk back into the room, and it will turn into a rendition of Full Metal Jacket. Listen up, you maggots! If you think this is going to be Candyland and unicorns, you are sadly mistaken. You are in our world now. This is a pretty darn quick way to signal to top performers that things are out of whack and it's time to jump ship. At the very least, it causes people to burn out very quickly because they're getting inconsistent messages. They don't know who to trust, and they shut down. They start to isolate themselves. Look, this is about awareness. Not every authority can implement every strategy. We get there are cost factors here, but there's bigger cost factors to not doing anything. Disengagement and burnout is costing the transit industry billions of dollars every year. Fixing this issue is going to require a multi-tiered, innovative set of responses. If it was easy, it'd already be done. It wouldn't be an issue anymore. There's a quote that I live by, and I think it's a very valuable quote around human behavior. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Change is a must. We cannot let disengagement and burnout cripple our industry any longer. And so we share these ideas with you in hopes that you can implement some of them and that you will be able to make some change to save your organization money and also improve the well-being of your lives and your employees' lives. We really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be sharing with you the resources that we spoke about, the Maslach Burnout Inventory, and some of the other research.
Great. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate you being here. Take care, everyone.